Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Thursday, September 21st. Indiana had its annual media day yesterday, but that's not the topic for today's show. Dylan Burkhardt of UMHoops is back to talk about our recent top 25 players in the Big Ten list for the 2023-24 season. That came out last week. In case you missed it, it was on UMHoops and Inside the Hall. And as usual, there are plenty of gripes, complaints about some of our selections, which we admit up front that we don't always get right. But Dylan, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. I don't know if you're exactly thrilled to talk about the list, considering all the feedback we got from it. But here we are. We're going to talk it through.
Yeah, I thought I was going to have a nice week on vacation, just post the list each day. And then I logged on to Twitter each day and I found out we were this disgrace to basketball. Basically. It was bad news. People were upset. It was fun times though. I like doing the list just because it gets me thinking about the upcoming season, starting to kind of dig into stuff. And I definitely think there's some wild misses on the list, but it's also fun to get people talking and thinking. And the reality is, I think it's easier to complain with a lot of people of being ranked too high on the list as far as it's easier to say that without saying, okay, well, who are you going to rank in front of them? And that's really kind of a weird situation in this conference this year where there's so many players who I want to but I have no idea if there's nothing to justify ranking them maybe where they are right now. So it's a weird year, I think, and it's going to be, I think we'll see a lot of surprises when we get to the postseason, all Big Ten teams from what we expect right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where we put it out as an exercise every year. We've been doing it. I'd have to look back, but at least probably 10 years that we've been doing this now, and we admit up front that it's not a perfect science. We're basically trying to project what's going to happen in any given season. And the well-documented misses are plentiful. You've got a year where we didn't rank Keita Bates-Diop and he won Big Ten Player of the Year. You've got a year where we ranked Christian Lander. I think there was a year where we didn't rank Nick Stauskas or didn't have him very high, and he may have won Big Ten Player of the Year. So it's a crapshoot, and we're basically trying to project a season where. And realistically, this year in the Big Ten, if you look at the list of players that we're trying to consider, I think you and I were in agreement that there was 5 or 6 that were basically set in stone when we came into the list. And after that, it was a pretty wild variance in terms of, who would be in the next tier. And then you get down to the last couple of spots and you're really trying to figure out who gets those last couple spots, and when you look at that also considered list, even after you hit publish, there's probably going to be some guys on here that are maybe a second team or third team all Big Ten. That's just the reality of the situation. So I want to put that out there before we dive into this. But in terms of the top of the list, I mean, obviously Zach Edey is the consensus choice for number one. Was it pretty unanimous in your eye? I mean, the next couple of guys, Terrence Shannon, Tyson Walker, Jameer Young, Boo Buie, to me, those were the clear guys, maybe not in that particular order. Were you pretty much set on those guys coming into it? And was there anyone else you considered maybe in those top 4 or 5 spots?
Yeah, so I think 4 of those guys were first team all Big Ten last year. And then I think Walker was probably second team. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a point guard who has a better season this year than Boo Buie, but I also don't think you can really rank someone else ahead of Boo Buie. It's kind of like those guys are set in stone mostly because of what they've done and who they are. I think the chance of any of those 5 being outside of the top 10 is extremely low. I don't know if they'll a lot of making the postseason all Big Ten team comes down to how good your team is, how good your season is. I think those guys are all clearly ranked in the top 5 where they should be. I think you go through any kind of national top 100, you'll find all of them. So I don't think there's really a lot of debate. Maybe there's debate around Terrence Shannon, Tyson Walker. I still think Shannon is the closest thing to maybe if there's going to be an upset for player of the year, I feel like Shannon has shown maybe some upside to get closer to that than anyone else. I would go. So I think we both went with him as our second pick. But look, this is Zach Edey's sport this year, right? Like he's the guy, he's the player of the year in every betting model, whatever you're going to look at. Like it's going to be Zach Edey. Here's a question for you. What would it take for Zach Edey not to win Big Ten Player of the Year this year?
No, that was actually what I was going to ask you, because last season we came into the year with Oscar Tshiebwe returning, right, from Kentucky, having won Player of the Year the previous year, and everyone picked him for National Player of the Year, and he doesn't end up winning it. And so I almost think there's a lot of years, the voters probably don't want to go with the same guy year over year. Now, that's probably not the case as much in Big Ten Player of the Year consideration because it's a smaller set of teams, but I can already see the national conversation in January and February if Edey's numbers are maybe not quite as good as what we saw last year, or maybe Purdue maybe they're a top 15 team and not a top 5 team, take some losses or something like that. And people are saying, well, Zach Edey is still the player of the year. The standard that he's going to have to live up to repeat as player of the year nationally is extremely high. Now, in the Big Ten specifically, I don't know that it's as high, but I think as long as his numbers are similar to last season and Purdue is the team that most people think that they're going to be, it's going to be hard for somebody to jump up and take that spot from him. It's, the guys that I think realistically would have a chance are the guys on the teams that could contend, I guess, in the Big Ten if somebody's going to supplant Purdue. And you look at Terrence Shannon Jr., I don't know if Illinois is a realistic chance to win the Big Ten, but let's say that they're second in the Big Ten and he has a crazy good year. I think he's got a chance. Tyson Walker, Michigan State, is the consensus number 2 pick to win or to be in the league standings. If he were to have a really good year, I think he would be a guy that you would consider. Jameer Young at Maryland. But I mean, for Big Ten Player of the Year, it's hard just because we know what Purdue's going to do, right, in terms of how their team's going to be built and on a given night, we know Edey's production is going to be pretty substantial. So I don't know that there's a if I was forecasting odds, I think there's 80-90% chance that he's Big Ten Player of the Year as long as he has a similar year to what he did last year. I think the more interesting thing is the National Player of the Year, because I think as somebody that's voted in the USBWA Player of the Year award, even I think have some hesitancy to vote the same guy year over year because, as you said, it's this bias, right? You're naturally inclined to try to look for somebody else, and it's hard to live up to. It's going to be hard for him to live up to the standard that he set last year. Is that kind of what you think as well in terms of? I think it's a good bet that he wins Big Ten Player of the Year, but National Player of the Year, I don't know that. I just think there's a lot of things that will be working against him to repeat that.
Yeah, I think Luka lost to Toppin, right, and then won National Player of the Year the next year, but he was Big Ten Player of the Year back-to-back years. And he did it without having to win the Big Ten. So what I was going to say is if Michigan State or Illinois wins the Big Ten, I think a lot of people would think long and hard about picking either Terrence Shannon or Tyson Walker, because what Edey does statistically would kind of be normalized. You would say, well, they didn't win the league, and then, okay, give it to the best player on one of those 2 teams. There are other teams that could win the league where you would say, I don't really see a Player of the Year candidate. But if either of those teams does win the league, I assume like Shannon or Walker has this awesome year. So I think there's a chance of that. I think there's also a chance that like Purdue knows what it has in Zach Edey. Last year, it was sort of establishing what it had in Zach Edey, and he had that stretch to start the year where he went like 13 games in a row with Ken Palm MVP. Purdue went on a preseason tour without him. Purdue has brought in new pieces. Purdue is going to realize that they can't just have Zach Edey. So there's got to be at least a little more balance, I would say, with what Purdue does this year, that I think leaves the door open for maybe someone else as an up-and-comer to do something that feels more unprecedented on kind of a National Player of the Year scale. So that, like, if you look at a Donovan Clingan, like, what if he is the Edey and Edey is the Oscar Tshiebwe? Like, all of a sudden, that kind of flips the script, right? So it's an interesting debate, and I do think people like to kind of fixate on whatever is new. Like there could be some freshman that has a big whatever. Like that's just going to get more headlines than, oh, Zach Edey had 25 and 20 again in a bye game win over whoever. So I think it's an interesting conversation, but it's still got to be Edey just because he can go for 20 and 20 like routinely. And if his teammates do improve and like it's a little more balanced team, I don't really see his production dipping that much, just probably being even more effective and more dangerous. So if there's a chance, I would say, but very, very small. Like you say, I think 90% sounds about right.
So I don't want to go through every player on the list because people have read the list. They know where everybody's ranked. They can look at it, but I do want to go through some of the more, I guess, controversial or picks that we got the most feedback on from a negative perspective. And I can give my insight on some of these as well, but I also want to get your input. But just kind of in the top 10, I think the two guys that I heard the most that people didn't necessarily agree with were Coleman Hawkins at Illinois going number 7, and then Zed Key obviously at number 10, Ohio State. Now, you and I both like Zed Key, and we also recognize that Zed Key was very good last year at the onset of the season, and then got hurt and didn't play particularly well. Ohio State didn't have a great season, but we're also, when we put together this list, we're projecting forward, trying to look ahead this season if Zed Key's healthy, or, you know, I know you're pretty high on Ohio State. I think I have them in my top 5 or 6 of the Big Ten going forward. So it makes sense to have a player from Ohio State represented somewhere, and I think he's the go-to option for them. In retrospect, do you think we missed on either of those players in terms of having them too high, or is this just the case of people looking at the list and then all of a sudden they see a guy and they perceive that should be ranked higher than them and they're nitpicking? Because, you know, I didn't, to be quite honest with you, when we hit publish on this, I didn't really look at Coleman Hawkins or Zed Key as guys that people were going to really have too big of a problem with. I mean, Coleman Hawkins has always been talented. He's not maybe been consistent, but this is his 4th year in college. He just got an NBA Combine invite last year, so he's obviously talented. I think there's a lot of things that he does that are unique for a player his size, and maybe it was a little bit of a bet that he finally figures it out and breaks out. But also, I just think from a talent perspective, he's justifiably a top 10 player. Now, whether or not he actually ends there is a different story, but I'm just kind of curious what, in retrospect, what you think about Hawkins and Key and where we put those guys.
Yeah, so I think Key is a miss. I think here's my initial thought process on Key. He's a guy we had in the top 15 last year. He was really, really good until he threw his shoulder out, basically playing up to what I think would be that level. He was truly awful after his shoulder injury. And I think it's hard to say that didn't affect him. Like, he was like literally in tears kind of playing through the pain by the end of last year. So I was like, okay, well, I think he can do similar things this year. I think Ohio State's going to be good. It's still way too high. I think he might make sense in the last 5 of the list, not like in the top 10, I would say. I do see the point of Felix Akpara is going to play some minutes. I think they'll probably both play together a little bit, but it's not like he's going to be playing 35 minutes. I get that. If I am very high on Ohio State, I think when I do my all Big Ten preseason ballot, I think I'll have a different Ohio State player on it than Key. And I don't know if that's probably equally as risky. Like, if we would have put Scotty Middleton in the top 10 on the list, like, people would have said that's crazy, right? He's the freshman who hasn't come in. But at the same time,
or if we would have put Bruce Thornton or Jamison Battle, who we both had on the list. But I mean, I think there's just as much of an argument as Zed Key as there is for Jamison Battle or Bruce Thornton.
Like,
right?
You could tell me Bruce Thornton would be the best point guard in the Big Ten this year, and I'd say there's a chance. You could tell me Bruce Thornton's not a top 20 player this year, and I'd say there's a chance. So it's tricky. So I think he's way too high. I don't think he's as bad as people wanted to make him out to be, and I get that he was really bad. But at the same time, like, Tyler Wall had a similar injury-impacted season where he wasn't nearly as good as we maybe thought he would be last year. Played through injury, was pretty awful. We didn't think about putting him on the list. So it's kind of grading on a curve a bit to say, well, if he's healthy again, he'll be good again, especially given that we don't know how healthy Zed Key will actually be this year. I know, I think I saw it recently. He was fully cleared to play, but I think that's a myth. Hawkins, I, I just you're going off the talent to put him in the top 10, which fine. Like he is a guy who's going to get invited to the NBA combine, and like he's in that conversation. I don't think he's ever really put it all together, but he's a really good defensive piece. And the reality of this is, look at the guys that are ranked below them and tell me who you're really that sure about. Ace Baldwin, Kasai Tominaga, Peyton Sanford, Dawson Garcia, AJ Storr, Xavier Johnson. Like, it's so hard to find someone you want to put in the top 10 that at least Coleman Hawkins kind of has that talent baseline that you're looking for.
So of that group that you just mentioned, Ace Baldwin, Tominaga, Sanford, Garcia, Storr, Xavier Johnson, who deserve to be higher than if we're saying that Key should have been much lower, which yeah, I can see that. I guess the problem with a lot of this is that we come up with the list and then people try to poke holes in it, and then I feel like sometimes our opinion can also be swayed based on the negative feedback that we get. But I do agree that a lot of your points on Key are accurate, but also if Ohio State's going to be the team that both of us think they're going to be, they also have to have a player that's going to play to at least to somewhat of an all Big Ten level. So I think it's at least justified in that regard. But maybe his resume doesn't say he's top 10. But who of that next group then deserved maybe to be higher? Or is there somebody that is even not on the list or even further down that maybe should have been up higher?
So I honestly think this is the greatest argument ever to use tiers. Like the tier, there's a top tier. There's a Zach Edey tier. There's like the Terrence Shannon, Tyson Walker tier. And then you kind of get to the top 6 that may be like really good players. 7 through 25, like I think you can put it in a hat and say, I don't know, man. Like some of these young point guards, right? Chucky Hepburn, Doug McDaniel, Bruce Thornton, who else? Like all of these young guards are going to come. Even like Tony Perkins isn't young, but he had a really productive year last year. One of those guys is probably going to be better than Ace Baldwin, who is a A10 transfer who comes over playing for a team that's probably going to be playing on Wednesday in the Big Ten tournament. It's way more likely that one or two of those point guards who we're not even talking about finishes better than Ace Baldwin, just all things considered. Like Ace Baldwin, very good player. It's still an up transfer on a team mostly made up of up transfers, either by playing time, like they're backups or they're from smaller conferences. You're going to tell me Ace Baldwin's going to be the, 4th best point guard in the league? I don't think that's nearly as much of a lock, despite the fact that he maybe has the longest resume of some of those other guys. So I think you're going to see a lot of guys playing their way into those 6 through 10 slots. I think there'll probably be a couple freshmen who make the all Big Ten second team. I think there will be some of those sophomores that you wouldn't really say has proven that they're a top 10 player, but I think they'll get there. Like that's how I look at the league this year, is if all these old guys that we're talking about are the 6 through 10 best player, it's going to be a pretty mediocre season. But when someone like Jaden Akins breaks through and is really good, like all of a sudden that kind of changes the look of things. So that's how I look at it right now. Maybe that's not fair on the guys who are on the list, but it's just sort of the feeling I get looking at the league.
Yeah, the other thing is it's so hard to predict transfers and freshmen. It was hard before the portal with just freshmen, and now you've got the portal, which we've got a guy, the transfer at Michigan. Tell me how you say his last name because I don't want to mispronounce it.
Olivier Kamwa.
Okay, Kamwa. We have him at 8. He comes in from Tennessee. He's a transfer. He's not an up transfer. He was obviously played at a really high level, so you feel good about him. I mean, Ace Baldwin, he was the A10 player of the year. You can call it an up transfer, but I mean, I think it's still a good league, and he's still a proven. I mean, he was the defensive player of the year in that league as well. So I think he's going to be a guy that maybe he's on a really bad team, but I think he's going to put up numbers. And do I think he's a first team All Big Ten player? I don't think you can be on a terrible team, but I think he can be second or third team if he plays to his potential. But the freshman, we put one freshman on the list, Mackenzie Mbako, who's, a consensus top 10 player in the country coming in. But you've also got guys like Deshaun Harris-Smith at Maryland, Scotty Middleton at Ohio State. There's probably going to be another freshman or two. Yeah, Gavin Griffiths. I mean, last year we wouldn't have considered Connor Essegian, which I don't think he was a top 25 player last year. But
I'm going to be honest. I don't think we knew who Connor Essegian was at this point last year.
Well, I knew who he was because he was from Indiana, and there was a couple of people that read inside the hall that were like, Indiana should have recruited him because he's a shooter from Indiana and they need shooting, which in hindsight was probably correct. But
they should have, yes.
The freshman thing is just so hard because, I had somebody ask me this week, so why did we rank Mbako 22nd, but we ranked Romeo Langford 6th or 7th on the year when he came into the Big Ten? Well, I mean, we also ranked Christian Lander coming, and he was a 5-star recruit. So it's like, it's hard to, that's the hardest thing to me is figuring out the freshmen. And I think we've taken a more conservative approach on that. Would you agree that then maybe what will actually bear out in the results once the season ends?
Yeah, I also think we had like Caleb Houston 8 a couple years ago, which is probably too high. He obviously started and played a lot, but he had his ups and downs. I think part of it is maybe we've been more conservative, but the other part of it is in the current college basketball landscape, like the impact you're going to get from a top 20 freshman isn't quite what it has been maybe 5 or 10 years ago, right? Like there's so many transfers that now I don't know if like just being a top freshman is enough to make an impact. But last year, I think there would have been some players who maybe we could have been more aggressive on. I think part of it also is it's hard when you look at these teams to say, okay, this is a really good freshman. Is he also going to have a really big role? And figuring out the role and what they're actually going to do. Like Romeo Langford was that Indiana team. I don't know that applies to Mbako, but like that's kind of the thing to figure out. And I think that we probably were a little too gun shy maybe to rank some freshmen or even some transfers, right? Like you could see some of these transfers coming in being pretty decent in that bottom, like 15 to 25 range ahead of guys that we maybe know more about or so are more keen to rank.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. So if you were gonna, of the freshmen that we maybe didn't rank, who in your mind has the best chance to play their way into by the end of the season to an all Big Ten type of player?
I think Deshaun Harris-Smith and Scotty Middleton are two pretty obvious ones. I think Harris-Smith is kind of looked at as the starting guard next to Jameer Young. Basically, Jameer Young did everything for that team offensively last year. There's a lot of room for Harris-Smith, I would say, to get reps. Middleton is just kind of the solid two-way wing, a little overlooked, but some people have talked about him as a potential one and done. We've seen these wings kind of ranked 45th, show up at Ohio State, and all of a sudden they're averaging 16 points a game, and all of a sudden they're in the lottery. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if that was his path at all. I think Gavin Griffiths is another guy, like, losing Cam Spencer, they're going to just need, like, he could be Rutgers' leading scorer, or certainly like a double-digit scorer for that team. They need someone who can shoot, and like no one talked about Cam Spencer on the list, but if you're the guy who can make a shot surrounded by guys who can't, like, get him the ball. I think all three of those guys have a very good chance to be top 20 players when all is said and done.
So some of the other controversial, I guess, quote unquote, misses, Braden Smith, which I didn't, I was higher on Fletcher Lawyer than I was Braden Smith coming into the season. Purdue fans did not like the fact that we didn't rank Braden Smith, which, I mean, I feel like I've been as fair to Purdue as anybody covering Indiana could be. I mean, picking them to win the league again this year. I think they're a great team, but I also think they're a team that's built primarily around Zach Edey, and it's hard to figure out the other pieces on their team. Is there an argument that Braden Smith deserved to be on the list somewhere? probably, but we also go ahead.
Let the record show that I said Lawyer and Smith should be on the list, and you said pull one of them. I'm just throwing that out there. That was the conversation that was had. I think
that's fair.
I think he should be in a very similar place to Lawyer. I think you can probably make a case that he should be on the list over someone like Doug McDaniel in the back half. It's also a situation where I don't know what the Braden Smith ceiling is production wise, right? Like there are a lot of guys who are late in there who you're saying could play their way into all Big Ten second team. I think Braden Smith probably goes into this year as the 20th best player in the preseason and ends the year as the 20th best player, and Purdue wins the league and he does what he's supposed to do. Like, I don't know that there's, Braden Smith, all Big Ten first team guy, right? Like Zach Edey is going to be that team. But Purdue's really tough because, like you say, when you have one player that good and that dominant, it is hard for other players to kind of, that's what I saw a lot of. Like, oh, this team has 3 players ranked. How can they be this good? Well, sometimes you don't really want, like, having the best player is sometimes better than having 3 top 25 players. And the other thing I would say on Braden Smith is I think he's a top 25 player, but when things went wrong for Purdue last year, he was kind of in the middle of a lot of those situations. So there is a case against him, despite having a very, very good freshman year.
No, he was great at the start of the season, but I mean, maybe it's the last impression that I had of him, and it was the NCAA tournament game where he completely fell apart and was not good. And I mean, that's the biggest moment of the season. So, it's nothing against Braden Smith or Purdue. It's more of trying to figure out who's going to be the best player. And I thought that Lawyer deserved to be higher than him, which could be wrong. And I agree with what you're saying. Maybe he is the 20th best player by the end of the season, but it also feels like maybe that's his ceiling. Whereas some of these other guys, you can see a better path for them to maybe outperform their ranking. The other one that I think a lot of people disagreed with, which this is another player who I think it's a different situation than Braden Smith because he's, I think, a more talented player, but inconsistency and just motor have always been a question for me, is Julian Reese of Maryland, which, there's no arguing that he's a talented player, and we had him right there on the bubble, but there was, I think, some feedback from College Park and the fan base there that he should have been higher. And I think there was one it might have been Lindy's, which take that for what it's worth, but I think they had him second team All Big Ten in the preseason, which to me is just completely too high. I mean, is Reese is that a guy that we could look back on and say we really missed the boat on this, or I mean, to me, he feels like a guy that could maybe be third team All Big Ten by the end of the year, but I don't necessarily view him as a guy that's going to be 7th best player in the league by the end of the season.
Yeah, I think he has a very strong case to be top 25. I don't see him likely as like a top 10 guy, really. I do think he's pretty, like, there is kind of a changing of the guard with some of the bigs in the league, right? So I think you will see some bigs put up pretty big numbers this year. He needs to figure out how to make free throws. Like, that's a huge hole in his game. He shot 53% at the line last year. That's scary bad number. I have a hard time with Maryland. Like, Donta Scott was a fixture in the top 15 in this list for like 3 years. He's still the same guy. Like, he could be a player still, right? So I don't know. Should he be in the list? Like, probably you can make a case that he maybe has a better case than some of these other guys, but also, what isn't, like, this is what we talked about with player of the year for like, what's a 5th year of Donta Scott? Like, his 3-point percentage kind of bottomed out. It's just way easier to get excited about someone like Harris Smith coming in there, something different, because we've kind of seen this and it hasn't really manifested itself into this kind of go-to all-league star necessarily. So could Reese be an all Big Ten player? For sure. Is he I don't know. I think I had him in like the 20s in my initial list. So that's where I would kind of slot him in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same is true for like Patrick McCaffrey, Malik Hall. I mean, these are guys that have been on the list in previous years, and then they really never kind of outperformed in what we projected them to be. So I think you talk about like the bias for voting and player of the year and things like that. I think it comes into play here too when we've ranked these guys in previous years and they haven't really performed maybe up to the level, then we're going to look at the list and we're going to say, Patrick McCaffrey, you're out. We just saw what Peyton Sanford did the last half of the season for Iowa, and we're looking ahead to this year, and we're going to say, well, he's probably going to be the guy who's producing more than getting more of the shots and having a bigger role in the offense. I mean, the same thing kind of with Malik Hall, who to me is like one of the better glue guys and kind of role. I don't want to call him a role player, but he's a solid player. But you look at Michigan State's team and you can see a better argument for guys like Jaden Akins and AJ Hoggard and Tyson Walker being included on the list rather than a guy like with Hall, who I think is a super productive player. And I mean, you'd love to have him on your team, but when we're talking about like the cream of the crop in the league and we've ranked him in previous years, I just think it's harder to get excited about somebody like that. And maybe that's, a fault of the list and how we're doing it. But I just think that comes into play. I mean, do you disagree with looking? I mean, maybe you're thinking of it differently, but in the back of my head, I'm kind of like, some of these guys, it's like, all right, we've ranked them in previous years and they didn't live up to it. So it's harder to get excited about them. Yeah.
So Malik Hall is really interesting to me because I've always been a big fan of his game. I've always thought there was kind of another level. Last year was really a tough season for him, injury-wise and everything else, and it just didn't it never turned into anything. But the reality is, if you ask any coach in the league, would you rather have Malik Hall or Jamison Battle as your 3-4? Like, I think I'm probably taking Malik Hall personally. I know Battle has put up stats and done all this on whatever team, but they both have some health concerns. I kind of think, given that Michigan State's going to be the better team, most likely, I feel like there's a case for Malik Hall in that. But again, it's hard, right? He's always been kind of this sixth man in between roles. But the reality is, Joey Hauser's gone. They need a wing to step up and take a bunch of shots. Like, there's a world where that is Malik Hall, and he can make shots, he can score, he can play multiple positions. Like, I think there's a pretty clear argument. And I think you can make another case for a guy in a similar boat, like Chucky Hepburn. Chucky Hepburn was Braden Smith at this point last year. It was like, he is the new point guard of the Big Ten. They won the league. He was a true freshman. His sophomore year was not really a disaster, but for Wisconsin, it wasn't as good. So now all of a sudden you're looking like, oh, he had a 9.90 rating, whatever else. But could he be an all Big Ten player this year? Absolutely, right? So I think it's hard with Wisconsin, where we definitely fell in love with the new guys, right? Like AJ Storr. We're probably too high on AJ Storr. I think he can add a element to that team, but 14th might be a little, or wherever we had him, might be a little too rich. Same with Connor Sejan, like, good player. But guys like Wall and Crowell were on the list last year, and we didn't rank them. Like, if Wisconsin's better, it's a hard thing to sort out.
Yeah, but I think the argument for those guys is that Wisconsin's going to be better because Sejan and Storr are going to be better. Like, if Wisconsin would have just run it back with Hepburn and Crowell and Wall, and they don't add Storr, and then Sejan's more of a role guy, like, I don't think you're as excited. I think the reason to get excited maybe a little bit more about Wisconsin is AJ Storr is not like a typical Wisconsin player, right? He's coming from a up and down, high tempo team, and into a system and into a situation that's really not similar at all. And I think, like, you look at him and you're like, this is a guy that can give them a different look, a different type of player than what they have. And I think this, if he's a really good addition to their team and kind of bring some of that athleticism, the scoring, that to me is more potentially impactful than just kind of trying to run it back and beat people 47-45. Not to say that Wisconsin's still not going to do that, but I mean, like, to at least have a guy that can do some different things on offense and is a little bit, makes Wisconsin more interesting for me to watch.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I like Storr. I just think it's kind of speaks to the process and how hard this is in the basically 7-25 range this year.
Yeah. So the last guy I have to ask you about, which I had no problem where we had him, and apparently IU fans didn't like the fact that we had Xavier Johnson 16th, and they were, Xavier Johnson was a solid player in his first season in Indiana. They don't make the tournament that first year of Mike Woodson's era with without Xavier Johnson's play in the Big Ten tournament. I think a lot of things goes to Michigan for blowing a 17-point second half lead, or Indiana's kind of trajectory as a program might not be the same as what it is right now. But Xavier Johnson was a big part of that. And then last season, he struggled, I thought, to figure out his role early with Jalen Hood-Schifino. Then he got hurt. He was not very good in the two early Big Ten games. He did play well against Xavier, but he probably gets docked a little bit for being hurt last season. But to have him fringe third team All Big Ten, I thought was more than fair. What is that? Just, I mean, I think you were maybe probably even a little bit lower than that on Xavier Johnson. What do you see with that situation in terms of the ranking, and were we too high on him? Were we just about right, or where did you fall on that?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised to see people thought he should be significantly higher than that. He's played 5 years of college basketball, has never had a turnover rate under 20%. He is coming off of an Achilles injury, right? It's Achilles or foot?
It was a broken foot.
Broken foot. He's never shot better than 50% on twos. Like, yes, he had some awesome moments for Indiana late, 2 years ago. I think 15 feels pretty reasonable. Like, I think you can make a case. I would not say he's one of the, I think there's so many other point guards in this league that have a real chance to make a leap. And I'm not sure what this Xavier Johnson looks like as really the only guard on Indiana who's going to do anything with the ball. I think that's kind of scary in a lot of ways. And I could see him having a pretty inefficient season if he's called on to score and create, and there's just not a lot of perimeter help. Jalen Hood-Schifino was a lot better offensively once he came into the mix in Xavier Johnson's role than Xavier Johnson was playing next to Hood-Schifino, I would say. So I think there's some concerns there. I think he's still a 24-year-old, fifth year, whatever, senior. He's an experienced guy. Sixth year senior. He's an experienced guy. He's going to be productive. I think he makes sense on the list. But the idea that he should be this top 10 player in the Big Ten feels like a bit of a stretch to me. And again, I understand that it's hard to say anyone's a top 10 player in the league, but I'd be way more into a Bruce Thornton if you're going to say this is going to be the breakout point guard in the league. I
agree with you on that. I mean, and that's something against Xavier Johnson. I think he's a key to Indiana's season. I think he's a good player. I think he's defensively can really be
very good.
Important piece for Indiana, but he's also got to be. This year's critical for him just in terms of. I think he's going to have to score more because Indiana lost something like 70% of its scoring from last season. I've been saying that stat, but I think it's pretty close to that. It's somewhere in that range. They lost a ton of scoring, and he's going to have to score more. But that's also kind of scary from the standpoint of he's going to have to figure out how to facilitate. 2 years ago, I think he was fourth in the Big Ten in assist rate, which was a good number for him. But how is he going to strike the balance between the two? So that to me, I thought was fair, more than fair for him. The last guy I just want to ask you about real quick, another Indiana player that we didn't rank that, in terms of talent, you would say this guy is potentially someone that you would consider, but I just feel like he's so much of an unknown that nobody can really say definitively what he's going to look like this season. Is Khalil Ware. What do you make of? I mean, you cover college, or you follow college basketball pretty closely as anybody. What do you kind of make of him coming into the league? Like talking to Indiana players yesterday at media day, they're talking about this guy's a pick and pop big. Watching the video of him from this summer at the Nike camp out in Oregon, he's handling the ball on the perimeter and gliding to the back. That doesn't look like a traditional big in the Big Ten, but I just don't know how that is going to translate into a league that oftentimes we get into, January and February and they're playing tackle basketball under the rim, and it's a lot more physical than maybe what he's accustomed to. So what do you make of Khalil Ware?
Yeah, he's a guy I feel like you could just throw a dart. If you tell me he ends up third in the end of the year or 33rd, I would believe you if you were kind of ranked players in the postseason. There's just such a wide range of outcomes. obviously, like you have to consider ranking him just because he's a guy on the NBA radar. He has that talent, right? He's a lob threat. Like there's not more length and athleticism than really any player in the league, probably, right? So if you were thinking about Hello, where coming into this league a year ago, you'd be like, wow, okay, he's an All-American, he's this guy, he's that. And everything went south out west. Like it is what it is. I don't know what that means for him going forward. I think there's obviously questions there. I think it's pretty fair to point all those out. But at the same time, there's real upside. Like I don't think you can say the Big Ten is just kind of grinding the game and he's not ready for that. But if he's playing as a second big, like his ability to stretch the floor, throw down lobs, like those are all really useful things. Like I think he can be a really good player. I don't really know what to expect from Indiana offensively as far as what they look like, what they run. I don't really know how to think about Indiana without Trace Jackson Davis. So that's kind of a curious part of all this is what does that all look like? Because I have no idea what to even think or expect in that regard.
Don't you kind of feel the same way about Michigan without Hunter? Like what to expect?
Very similar. It's very similar. I think that we saw a little bit of like what Juwan Howard would do without Hunter with the kind of the Xavier Simpson team. And like there's a lot of that ball screen stuff that I think will stick, and you can kind of see it with Doug McDaniel. IU is interesting to me because you have Xavier Johnson back, but it's never really been a high volume ball screen offense, right? So I don't know. Like Michigan very much is in a similar boat, and you could probably apply that to a lot of teams in the league, but there's just, we don't know what to expect. These teams are going to run differently, right? Like Michigan's main option is a power forward. That's just very different than anything we've seen for a few years at the league.
Well, Dylan, thanks for taking the time to come on the show today. I know you're just getting over an illness and you battled through. We appreciate you doing that today and coming on and talking about the list. It's a fun thing that we get an opportunity to do every year. I guess it's fair to say that we don't take it maybe as seriously as some of the people that consume the list. I mean, we obviously try to do our best with it, but we also acknowledge up front that we're going to have plenty of misses, and we like to go back after the season and even have some fun and laugh at ourselves. So don't take it too seriously.
Thanks for having me on. It's all in good fun. I'm ready to put the list behind us and move on to something else people can get mad about, like Big Ten picks or something like that.
Yeah, the official unofficial Big Ten media poll will be out before we know it here in a couple weeks, Big Ten Media Day, and then we'll have secret scrimmages and everything else that we'll get excited about, and then the actual games will start, and we'll forget about all this preseason talk, and we'll actually be into basketball. But as I said, something to pass the time in the off season, something that we've been doing and enjoy doing. So don't take it too seriously. Thanks everybody once again for listening to the show. It really helps if you leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.